Kalorama, a recorded books hybrid imprint, presents Mythologies Without End, the U.S., Israel, and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1917 to 2020, First edition. By Jerome Slater. Read by Christopher Grove. Prologue. Like almost all Jews of my generation, coming of age in America in the 1940s, immediately after the Holocaust and with anti-Semitism still alive in this country, I thought of myself as a passionate Zionist and rejoiced over the establishment of the State of Israel and its 1948 and 1967 victories over its Arab enemies. From 1957 to 1960, I served as the anti-submarine warfare officer on a U.S. destroyer. Some years later, after Egypt acquired 4 submarines from the Soviet Union, I wrote to the Israeli embassy in the United States and offered to serve as an ASW officer on an Israeli destroyer if a new war with Egypt were to break out before the Israelis could train their own people. My offer was politely declined, and in any case, I changed my mind when it became apparent that soon after the 1967 war, Gamal Abdel Nasser and then his successor, Anwar Sadat, were seeking to end the Arab-Israeli conflict, but were being stonewalled by the Israeli government of Golda Meir. I considered writing to Meir to say that if Israel blundered into an unnecessary war with Egypt, which of course in 1973 it did, she should consider my offer as cancelled. For the past 50 years I have been studying, teaching, and writing about Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict, and have many close connections in that country. I've been there many times, served as a Fulbright lecturer at Haifa University in 1989, and given lectures at other Israeli universities. I continue to have many dear Israeli friends. During this time I've become convinced that Israel, with essentially blind U.S. Jewish and government support, is well along the road to both a moral and security disaster. The first step Israel must take to prevent matters from getting even worse is to come to terms with the historical truth. Doing so may even be the sine qua non to provide justice to the Palestinians, to save itself as an enlightened democracy, and perhaps even literally save itself from an attack by fanatical Arab terrorists who have somehow acquired nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction. The prospects today for a just peace, it must be said, have never been so dim. What then is the purpose of this book? Or even for completely secular Jews like me, what is the point of thinking of ourselves as part of the Jewish people if we fail to align ourselves with the best values of Western civilization, to which Judaism has made a fundamental contribution? There was a time when it was widely accepted, and not just by Jews, that the Jewish culture and tradition were particularly committed to reason, truth, and justice. Consequently, when Israel was founded and vowed to be a light unto the nations, the belief was widespread that it might actually fulfill this promise, or at least try to. Today, that seems quaint, if not downright preposterous, but it wasn't always so. I write now in the hope that an effort at honesty and accuracy might perform some service. I feel something of a personal responsibility. These are, in some sense, my people. Their mythologies have blinded them to the true history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and in their oppression of the Palestinian people they have abandoned enlightened Jewish traditions, which in my secular view constitute the best reasons for Judaism to have survived for 25 centuries. One can only hope that correcting the historical record can make a contribution to justice, as well as truth. Introduction. Every nation has a narrative or stories about its history that are instilled into its citizens generation after generation. The narratives explain much about a nation's motivations, policies, and actions. In order to understand why nations behave as they do, then, it is essential to know what they believe about their history. However, no matter how sincerely and deeply held, national narratives often, perhaps typically, are misleading or simply untrue, embodying as they do mythologies that cannot stand up to serious examination, and which, therefore, may be disastrous both for the peoples who believe in them and to others who are affected by them. In what has become a cliché, but nonetheless invaluable, Daniel Moynihan famously observed, "Everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts." Perhaps in no other major international conflict has the gap between opinions, or myths as in this context I shall call them, and demonstrable historical facts been as great as they are in the Arab-Israeli and the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts since the early 20th century. As a result, perhaps in no other international conflict have these myths, which still dominate Israeli and U.S. political discourse, had such devastating consequences for both peace and justice. In 1973, Abba Eban, the eloquent Israeli diplomat, said, "The Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity," an argument, better said, a myth, that was widely accepted and continues to have a huge impact on how the Arab-Israeli conflict has been understood in Israel, the United States, and most Western states. But that assessment was wrong then, and wrong since. If anything, the converse is close to being the case. One of the central purposes of this book, then, is to correct this myth, both in the interests of historical accuracy and in an effort to pave the way for policy changes in Israel and the United States. Since the creation of Israel in 1948, there have been some 14 wars, or at least major armed clashes, as well as many smaller ones, between Israel and Arab states, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and the Islamic militant movements of Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. These include the 1948, 1956, 1967, and 1973 wars, principally with Egypt and Syria, the 1978, 1982, 1993, 1996, and 2006 attacks against Hezbollah and the PLO in Lebanon, and 5 major Israeli attacks against Arafat and the PLO in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, 2000 to 2001, 2002, 2008 to 2009, 2012, and 2014. In addition, for more than 15 years, the Israeli blockade or siege of Gaza, as it is widely called, has amounted to economic warfare. None of these wars and lesser conflicts, probably even the 1948 Israeli War for Independence, were unavoidable. Israel's independence and security could have been protected had it accepted reasonable compromises on the 4 crucial issues of the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts: a partition of the historical land of Palestine, Palestinian independence and sovereignty in the land allotted to them in the 1947 UN Partition Plan, including Arab East Jerusalem, the return of most of the territory captured from the Arab states in the various wars, and a small-scale symbolic return to Israel of some 10,000 to 20,000 Palestinian refugees, or their descendants, from the 1948 war. The historical record, examined in detail in this book, demonstrates that it has been Israel, far more than the Palestinians and the leading Arab states, that has blocked fair compromise peace settlements. As a result, the conflict has continued for some 100 years, making it one of the world's most important and, at times, most dangerous unresolved international conflicts. The overall Arab-Israeli conflict can be seen, paradoxically, as one of the world's most difficult, yet simplest international conflict to resolve. By definition difficult, since after a century it still hasn't been settled. On the other hand, the solution is obvious and has been widely understood from the onset of the conflict, even by many, and sometimes most, of the participants. 2 peoples, each having historical, religious, and political claims to the same land, are locked into endless conflict. What can be done? For at least 75 years, study after study, international commission after international commission, negotiations after negotiations have come to the same, nearly self-evident conclusion. The land must be divided between the 2 peoples on an equitable basis, the 2-state solution. There is another paradox, precisely because it has gone on so long and is so potentially dangerous, the Arab-Israeli or Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of the most studied international conflicts by historians, political scientists, psychologists, journalists, and in the extensive memoirs and analyses of former political and military leaders. Yet it continues to be misunderstood, especially by the Israelis and their supporters, largely because their dominant historical narrative is the product of mythologies that are misleading or flatly wrong. According to the conventional Israeli narrative, the story Israelis tell themselves and others, the Arab-Israeli conflict is the consequence of over a century of Arab hatred of the Jews, and of their unwillingness to agree to numerous Zionist, Israeli, and international efforts to reach a fair compromise over the historic land of Palestine, starting with the Palestinian and Arab state rejection of the 1937 British Peel Commission Compromise Plan, and especially the 1947 United Nations UN Partition Plan. The UN plan provided for the division of Palestine between the Jews and the Arabs, and the creation of the State of Israel. In a spirit of compromise, the Israeli narrative holds, the Zionist leadership accepted the UN plan, but the Palestinians and their neighboring Arab states rejected it, and in 1948 launched an unprovoked invasion designed to destroy the new Israeli state. In the course of the ensuing war, the narrative continues, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living within Israel's boundaries fled to the neighboring Arab states, ordered or urged to do so by the invading Arab armies, even though the Zionists opposed the Palestinian exodus, hoping to demonstrate that Arabs and Jews could live side by side in the Jewish state. Thus, it is charged, it was the Arab states and the Palestinians who are responsible for creating the still unresolved Palestinian refugee problem that, along with other issues, continues to block a two-state settlement. After the 1948 war, the story continues, Israel remained willing to settle the conflict on the basis of generous compromise, but it could find no Palestinian or other Arab leaders with whom to negotiate. Consequently, the narrative holds, the conflict escalated into the Arab-Israeli wars of 1956, 1967, 1973, and 1982, all begun or provoked by continuing Arab rejectionism, terrorism, and unwillingness to live with the Jewish state of Israel. As well, the refugee issue remained unresolved, largely because it suited the cynical purposes of the Arab states to keep it festering, so as to undermine the security and viability of the Jewish state. As a result, with the aid of neighboring Arab states, especially Egypt and Syria, the Palestinians turned to guerrilla warfare and outright terrorism. The wall of monolithic Arab hostility was not breached, the Israeli narrative continues, until Anwar Sadat of Egypt decided to make peace with Israel in the late 1970s, followed 15 years later by King Hussein of Jordan. But even today, it is contended, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is no closer to being settled, because the Palestinians still hope to destroy Israel, rather than accept a fair compromise settlement. So goes the Israeli narrative. However, while there are some elements of truth in it, most of it does not stand up to historical examination. Though other Israeli mythologies will be examined, especially those concerning Zionist ideologies, the primary focus of this book will be on the many lost opportunities for peace in the 100-year conflict, and it will argue that it is Israel, not the Arabs, which has never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Unwilling to make territorial, symbolic, or other compromises, Israel has not merely missed, but sometimes even deliberately sabotaged repeated opportunities for peace with the Arab states and the Palestinians. Another focus of the book is on U.S. policy toward Israel, which has provided crucial political, diplomatic, economic, and military support for Israeli policies throughout the history of the conflict. With some exceptions, that support has been close to unconditional, and never more so than today, despite serious arguments that it jeopardizes not only U.S. national interests, but Israel's true interests as well. What best explains this remarkable state of affairs is complicated, and has been the subject of considerable dispute, as will be discussed in succeeding chapters. Why another book on the Arab-Israeli conflict? Despite the vast literature that deals with one aspect or another of the Arab-Israeli conflict, there is no up-to-date book that covers the entire history of the conflict and critically analyzes the major historical issues and controversies from its origins after World War I until the present, especially the lost opportunities for peace and what must change lest future openings also be squandered. The intended audience for this book includes the educated general reading public, college and graduate students studying the conflict, academicians and journalists with a general interest in international politics and U.S. foreign policy, specialists on the Arab-Israeli conflict who will welcome an overview that incorporates the most important literature on the major historical disputes, and, not least, political leaders, policymakers, and government officials in Israel and the United States. To these ends, the book will synthesize the vast existing literature on the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts and provide a demythologizing account of their history. Two premises underline this work: that historical truth is valuable for its own sake, and that a demythologizing history of the Arab-Israeli conflict is an essential prerequisite for changes in Israeli and U.S. policies that could pave the way for a final settlement. To be sure, at the time of this writing, Netanyahu still in power in Israel, Trump in the United States, the prospects for such changes range from very little to non-existent. Even so, it is important to provide the intellectual and psychological bases for reassessments that may take place in the future. As the Israeli historian Shlomo Sant has said in his own demythologizing work, historians cannot know whether changes in long-held attitudes and historical narratives are possible. All they can do is hope that their books may somehow help to bring about the beginning of change. In each of the chapters and case studies in this book, the first question addressed will be, what are the facts? Then, what are their implications, especially in terms of the many lost opportunities for peace? Before beginning, it is necessary to acknowledge that this work is based on the existing literature rather than on original research in the primary documentary sources. This is unavoidable in the first instance because no one person could write a history of a 100-year conflict based on original research in the documentary sources. In any case, most of the relevant Israeli and U.S. documents over the past 25 to as long as 75 years are still unavailable. Israel currently does not release its security-related government documents for 70 years. Consequently, the public records for such cases, which Israel defines very broadly, are available only through 1950. Even so, some Israeli historians have gained access to classified documents. All the more reason a work of this kind must be based on secondary materials. The U.S. government classifies its documentary records for 25 to 50 years, depending on their level of sensitivity. Consequently, the most important ones after 1980 are not available. As a result, then, this book is primarily a work of synthesis and interpretation of the existing literature. It will cover the entire history of the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts and the U.S. role in them, bringing together the best and most important existing works, with special emphasis given to those of leading Israeli journalists, historians, political scientists, philosophers, and especially to the autobiographies, memoirs, and other commentaries by former Israeli government officials, diplomats, military leaders, and intelligence officials. A word on source citations. Since the work is based on the vast secondary literature, including many hundreds of books, scholarly studies in political science and history journals, and Israeli and American newspaper stories, a strict listing of all the sources would result in many thousands of citations. Therefore, I have cited only those works that fit into one of the following categories: those that are widely regarded as the most authoritative works on the topic, those which I have directly quoted or closely paraphrased, and those in which the quality of the writing and analysis are particularly impressive. It is also important to acknowledge that I don't read Hebrew. However, almost all the important materials by Israeli writers and in Israeli journals and newspapers, such as Haaretz, Israel's most important newspaper, are either written in or translated into English. I am not aware of any claim that an untranslated Hebrew book, article, or document is crucial to understanding the history of the conflict. If it were truly essential, it would soon be available in English. Plan of work. This book is both an analytic history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, a new 100 Years' War, it might be termed, and a series of arguments that challenges the conventional historical accounts. In each chapter, I will be asking two central questions. First, throughout the history of the conflict, what are the facts at issue and the best available evidence? Second, how should we think about those facts? What are their implications both for accurate history, truth, and public policy? The structure of the book. The first chapter is an overview of U.S. policies in the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. It examines the various factors that have accounted for the nearly unconditional support that the American government has provided Israel since its founding in 1948. Particular attention is paid to the controversial argument that the power of the Israel lobby is the most important explanation for U.S. policy. The subsequent historical chapters go into much greater detail on the role of U.S. policies. The second chapter, Zionism Reconsidered, reviews the history of Zionism from the end of the 19th century to today, and examines the validity and persuasiveness of the various arguments that comprise the Zionist ideology. The central argument is that it is crucial to separate what is persuasive and legitimate about Zionism from what is not merely unpersuasive, but is devastating both to Israel and the Palestinians. The book then moves to its main body, the history of the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. It is divided into three sections. Part 1 covers the origins and early years of the conflict between Israel and the leading Arab states, as distinct from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Chapter 3 examines the onset of the Arab-Israeli conflict from 1917 through 1947. Chapter 4 discusses the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. These chapters also focus on U.S. policies in this period, from Woodrow Wilson to Harry Truman's decision to recognize and support the creation of a Jewish state in Israel. Part 2 is entitled War and Peace in the Arab-Israeli State Conflict, 1948 to 2020. Separate chapters focus on the 1948 war, on the lost opportunities for peace in the 1949 to 1956 period, on the 1956 war between Israel and Egypt, on the 1967 war, on the Cold War and the Arab-Israeli conflict in the 1970s, on the Israeli-Egyptian peace settlement in the late 1970s, on the Israel-Jordanian peace settlement in the 1980s, on the Lebanese wars from the late 1970s through the mid-1990s, and on the Israeli-Syrian conflict between 1948 and the present. Part 3 is entitled War and Peace in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. It examines the Israeli-Palestinian conflict 1917 to 1988, the rise and fall of the peace process in the 1975 to 1999 period, the Camp David and Taba negotiations in 2000, the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and the rise of Palestinian resistance in the 2000 to 2008 period, the Israeli siege of Gaza, and the rise and evolution of Hamas, the attempts to renew the peace process from 2001 through 2016, and the U.S. and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the Netanyahu-Trump era, from early 2017 through the present. The book closes with a summary of its main arguments and their implications for U.S. and Israeli policies. This chapter is quite long. It is divided into two parts, the first third of which is a summary of the argument I have developed in the main body, and the evidence on which it is based. Those who have listened to the previous chapters may just wish to skim this section. and then go on to the overall conclusions and policy recommendations. On the other hand, those who have largely skimmed the main body should find a long summary to be useful. The rest of the conclusions goes well beyond just presenting the facts and letting listeners draw their own conclusions, as it explicitly argues the implications of the facts, especially in terms of how the conflict might finally be resolved. Part 1. The Arab-Israeli Conflict. 1. The United States and the Arab-Israeli Conflict. With rare and short-lived exceptions, since the UN partition of Palestine in 1947, the United States has strongly supported Israel and its policies toward the Arab world, particularly the Palestinians, even when many officials in the U.S. foreign policy establishment have believed that such support is harmful to American national interests. The U.S. support of Israel has been one of the most remarkable and unprecedented phenomena in the history of American foreign policy. There is considerable debate over what constitutes the best explanation for this story, especially over the role of the Israel lobby. This chapter provides an introduction to and overview of U.S. policies, which are then discussed in greater detail in the context of the historical review of the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts that constitutes the main body of this work. In many ways, the U.S. backing of a Jewish state is heartening, attesting to the great decline in anti-Semitism in the last 75 years, and its replacement by what might even be called philo-Semitism, and the respected position of the Jewish people throughout American society. There have been recent isolated attacks on Jewish synagogues or other targets, but these have been carried out by lone misfits and have been almost universally condemned in public opinion and by government officials at all levels. Yet it is also the case that the near unconditional U.S. support of Israel has enabled that country to spurn repeated opportunities for peaceful settlements of its conflicts with the Arab world, secure in the knowledge that even when American governments have disagreed with hardline Israeli policies, only rarely have they been willing to press for changes in them. What accounts for this situation? 4 major arguments, or sets of arguments, have been offered to explain it. The requirements of morality and shared religious and other values, public and elite opinion, especially that of all American presidents from Woodrow Wilson through Donald Trump, the strategic and national interests of the United States, and the power of the Israel lobby. In the following, I provide an overview of the major factors that are widely held to explain and justify U.S. policies toward Israel, followed by brief evaluations of their validity and persuasiveness. This should be understood as an introduction to later chapters, in which the arguments and issues are examined in the context of specific cases. For a number of reasons, after its creation in 1948, Israel quickly captured the imagination and sympathy of general as well as elite American opinion, of both political parties, of Congress, and of a succession of presidents. Among those reasons are these: Holocaust guilt. There is little doubt that in the early years following the Holocaust, the most important motivation underlying U.S. policy was the widespread and deeply felt belief that the United States had a fundamental moral obligation to support the creation and survival of a Jewish state. At the time, this sense of obligation clearly, and often explicitly, stemmed from a sense of guilt or shame among many policymakers and opinion leaders because the United States had done little or nothing to prevent the Holocaust, or even to mitigate its effects, as it could have, for example, by accepting large numbers of Jewish refugees from Nazism in the 1930s and 1940s. Shared values. Supplementing the post-Holocaust moral argument in explaining U.S. policy was the belief that Israel was an outpost of Western civilization in the Middle East, in light of the origins of most of its inhabitants at the time it was created, the perceived cultural and religious affinities, the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the declared values and principles of the new state, particularly regarding the kind of society and political system it proclaimed as its goals. The democracy argument. Israel has benefited from the belief, in the abstract at least, that the United States should support fellow democracies, from its creation down to today. Israel has been regarded as the only democracy in the Middle East, an area.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?